Welcome. This is the third phase of a three-part series on SoftLogic as applied to EPC projects in the oil and gas industry. The final phase of the EPC is construction, and that's what we're dealing with here. And what we're trying to track here in SoftLogic is the bulk installation. And that's primarily piping, electric bulks, wiring cable tray, instrumentation, that would be the receive, check out, and install, and in some cases structural steel. But that has to be your call, whatever you think is the best way to do that. But again, if you might have noticed, as we're moving through these three phases, that the elements that we have to control are becoming more voluminous, more complex. And so it's even more that we adhere to the watchwords for SoftLogic, in which less is more. We want to take as much detail off the schedule so that there's greater visibility to those elements that really do require a rigid installation sequence and monitoring, because that's more likely where your critical path is going to be. The basic tenets of SoftLogic, like we mentioned before, apply to the drawing specifications, requisitions, purchase orders, and now any bulk installation or repetitive activity that does not have an inherent hard logic relationship to other similar activities. These should all be carried off schedule. So now with pipe, there is a certain sequence. You want to put the large bore in before you put the small bore, and if you have any HVAC duct or something like that, it should probably go in first too. Essentially large to small, and you want to have a point of departure or termination. So you don't generally install the middle without one of the ends. But beyond that, it doesn't really matter, especially if you were to do this in the pipe rack, what you would install. And the thing to keep in mind here is use the tool best suited for the task. I find most superintendents like the spreadsheet. Myself, I'm beginning to move more towards databases when I'm trying to combine all the information from these various spreadsheets. And the thing that kicks everything off is the estimate. So if it's in the estimate, we have to track it. And by that I mean anything that has a direct labor hour attributed to it. So anything that has a time variable component, we have to track. So as I did in the others, I will leave you with the little mantra here. Keep it simple. The less detail we have on the schedule, the better. But that does not mean we do not keep track of everything. So this is where it starts. This is the Class 5 estimate. I cleaned it up a little bit here. This is the Excel data dump that you'll get from most estimating programs. I wished I could say there's a standard, but there is not. Whereas most scheduling is done, at least in oil and gas, in P6. You get different data dumps from different estimating programs, and in fact, as many of the larger companies have proprietary estimating programs. So this is simplified just to these tabs here. There were about an even dozen tabs, and if you will notice, we have all kinds of columns. It's very complex. So what I find is that I move almost everything into to Access, and here are my basic tabs here, my tables, my queries. Thing about a query is I can distill it to what I want to see in my pivot table. I will go back to Excel and use a Power Pivot table like this. That just seems to make it ever so much easier to work with. So what we want to look at here is we're going to focus on piping. And we're going to focus on this particular WBS, the first one here. And as you'll notice, it gives me about 63 items. And what I did here is just move this into another to spreadsheet just to make it a little bit easier. And also I had to make some adjustments to the man hours. But we're going to close to this number here, this 10,539. And if you go over to our pivot table over here, this just gives you some idea of how overly complex this whole thing becomes, because we have all of these things. But I want you to pay attention here to the WBS. This is the WBS that we're using. You may find it a little more handy here, I think. You might be able to read this a little bit easier. This gives you some idea of how not necessarily complex as it is just overly detailed. People put this together were thinking more of cost organization than they were geographical centers. I would have constructed this thing much differently, but that was not my choice. You work with what you've got. So you start from the Class 5 estimate. I only cleaned this up just so that you would have something to look at a little bit better. Just removed a number of the columns, and I would, for the most part, always go to my spreadsheet, my pivot table here. So what we want to come back to now is our activities. And we're going to focus here on this fit, weld, hang piping, and this is the WBS. It's 1.2.1 water tanks, potable water, and you'll see that we're closing here to the correct number of hours. This was just my little exercise that to make sure I had resource load leveled as much as possible. I do all my resource leveling by hand. So here are our resources. Set this thing up beforehand, and nothing magical here. These are just the resources that I used for this particular activity. We're using a 10-hour day, 7 days a week. This really meant 2 shifts. They would work for 2 weeks and then come in and shift out, and it was 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. This was high altitude. They were actually working closer to 12 hours. But productivity was so bad, we reduced it to an effective 10-hour day. So that's kind of what you see, and this is just showing you how we're close to that whole thing. And in this particular case, I said we're going to have 40 guys doing this particular activity for approximately 26 days. Did this through for all of the piping activities. And you can see that even though we are using SoftLogic, this particular schedule has about 790 activities. It shows it at 1.8 million man hours. Take that for a grain of salt. It's really not that. But that's what we're closing to. That's what the estimate said. That's what we have to close to. And so this gives you some idea of how complex the whole thing is. But it's still, even at 700 activities and 1.8 million man hours, it's far easier to control this than it would be anything else. But I would go back to what we showed before. This right here, and I would expect us to do something. I was hoping to see some drawings over here. That we would have which one of these were assigned to a drawing, and we would develop our earned value from this. We would try to control to a drawing. And in fact is, if we had had them, that might have been the sequence that we would offer. We would try to work everything. We do have the size of the pipe here. And I can't say I fully understand their coding system, but that would be one thing to look at, is to, had we had drawings or something to organize this thing, I would try to put all of the drawings together and work out some kind of a sequence with my superintendent so that I know that he's going to try and work on something. What he works on within that drawing, I don't really care. Except I assume he's going to leave some of the super small bore, the vents and drains till the very end. But again, I don't care. Here's my man hours. And I'm closing now. I have listed to 10/5/39. So this is how it happens. This is how I would do this happens to be a mine in South America, and it's not very well organized. I wish I'd had more control over it, but I don't. I will call your attention to my risk codes here. We'll put this together in the next video on schedule forecasting. I'll just call it to your attention just so that you understand why it's here. So this is what we've got, and I think that you will see, yeah, we've done a pretty good job here. Research leveling is not perfect, but it's really not that bad either. And it tells management just about everything they need to know. And overall, it looks pretty good. One of our problems here, of course, is that we have a base camp that we had to build before we could do anything. And you can see it up here. Camp B and Camp A. So I hope this at least raises the question that soft logging may be appropriate to your scheduling activity. If there's any questions, we'll try to deal with them online. Do let me know.